So as Yassine has said, I will give you a broad introduction to the issue of seafloor integrity before we come to the more detailed paper that you have for the meeting and the proposal for Ecological Objective 6. And in this presentation, I will aim to cover a bit about the characteristics of the seafloor in the Mediterranean, the main threats to the seafloor, why it is important to study the issue of the seafloor in terms of monitoring and assessment, some best practices that come from other parts of Europe in the MSFD context, and then to look briefly at the relationship to Ecological Objective 1 on benthic habitats. So just to remind you that the Ecological Objective 6 is about, this is the agreed objective that seafloor integrity is maintained, especially in the priority benthic habitats. And by contrast, there's a closely related EO1, which is about the maintenance of the biological diversity, and the quality and occurrence of coastal and marine habitats are in line with prevailing physiographic, hydrographic, geographic, and climatic conditions. And as a very brief introduction, I'll come back to this a bit later. The general perspective is that we can see the EO1 is targeted towards very specific habitats, often subject to significant threats and needing very targeted protection measures. And you will all be aware of this in relation to Posidonia meadows in the Mediterranean. In contrast, the EO6 proposal is to take a wider perspective on the state of the Mediterranean seafloor, which is subject to a very wide range of pressures and needing broader management actions. So a very little bit about the general structure of the Mediterranean at a sort of landscape level. It's like on land, we have sediment plains, we have canyons, seamounts, great structures in the ocean. And these diagrams here give a little flavor for the variation in seabed character. This one on the right, you can see the many tentacles of the canyons that come down from the Gulf of Lion and onto the Spanish coast. And then, as well as this sort of landscape perspective, the seabed can be considered to have a set of broad habitat types described based on their substrate and their biological zones. Just lost my meeting. Right. Sorry about that. And in contrast, then the specific habitats under EO1, we have focused in particular on Posidonia beds and marl beds and coralligenous beds. So these are the ones that are very well known, often very close to the coast, that come under a lot of threat. So from the broad perspective, the seabed of the Mediterranean has been mapped through the EMODNet EU CMAP system, and it has a range of broad habitat types based on the substrate, whether it's sand or mud or rock, and based on the biological zone, whether it's shallow infilitral, circulitral, going down into the bathyal and the abyssal zones. And you see that the biggest variety of habitats is around this coastal strip on the continental shelf area. Now, this map is derived from the Barcelona Convention habitat classification, which is a hierarchical classification, and it is embedded, it's very clearly part of the European habitat classification system. And you'll see it goes from a very broad character, the level 1 marine, down to level 5, in which there are 266 different habitat types. So there's a great variety of different habitats on the seabed. And at level 2 in the system, there are described 42 habitat types, comprising of the combination of 6 substrate classes and 7 biological zones, which you can see in this diagram here. So we have rock and coarse and mixed and sand and mud, and we have the shallow infilitral and circulitral, and going into the deeper bathyal and abyssal zones. And these this structure, this level 2 structure, then is taken and used in the MSFD context as a set of 22 broad habitat types. So there are some simplification of this level 2 structure for MSFD implementation purposes. And just then to explain the relationship to the EO1 habitats, these are more finely described habitats, and they sit within the classification system within some of these particular broad habitat types. So they're at levels 4 and 5. Now, by way of threats to the seafloor, I looked at the range of threats that are defined in the Marine Strategy Framework Directive. This is the list of threats and pressures that are used in that system, and I tried to get a handle on the importance of the different threats for the seafloor. And you can see here that the ones in the darker orange, the non-indigenous species, the extraction of wild species, which is fishing, physical disturbance, the input of nutrients, and then the climate change issues are the pressures that would have the most widespread and extensive effects on the seafloor. Of course, all the other pressures have, to a lesser extent, some influence on the seafloor, but often this seems to be much more localized. And so the next series of slides give you a very brief overview of the distribution and intensity of some of these main pressures. But these are taken from a Europe-wide data set developed for the European Environment Agency by the European Topic Center, and provide the distribution of these pressures on a 10-kilometer by 10-kilometer grid cell. And so here, this first one, the non-indigenous species, you can see the distribution of the data, and that the intensity of the numbers of non-indigenous species is highest in the east of the Mediterranean, as you would expect, due to the influence of species coming in through the Suez Canal. The extraction of wild species, this is primarily the commercial fishing on the seabed. This is probably the most widespread and damaging of the pressures on the seabed. And you can see that this is largely confined to the areas above 1,000 meters. Below 1,000 meters, of course, the GFCM has put in place a ban on bottom trawling, and so the fishing is largely confined above that zone, but it covers great extents of that area. And I would say that in this map, probably there is a need for extra data to come in for the south and the eastern countries to supplement that which is already available. When it comes to physical loss of the seabed is a very damaging activity, of course, to the habitat that was natural habitat that's originally there, but that loss tends to be rather small in terms of its footprint. If you can imagine the building of a port or an offshore structure, an offshore oil and gas rig, you lose the seabed, but the footprint is rather small in comparison to the physical disturbance aspect. So here the physical loss is scattered right throughout the Mediterranean, but with relatively small footprint. And here the physical disturbance pressure, most of this map is reflected in the bottom trawling data, but there are a range of other pressures added to this from wind farms and sand and gravel extraction and shallow shipping and a variety of other different activities. And then the final pressure I'll talk about is the eutrophication, the nutrient enrichment. This particular map is compiled from the 2023 QSR assessments, and these assessments are actually focused on the water column, on the level of nutrients in the water and the chlorophyll. So where you see not good status, the red areas, the assessment is related to the water column, and so we don't yet fully understand how much that might be influencing the seabed, but it gives an initial proxy for the effects of nutrients on the seabed. And of course, all of these pressures come together and can act upon each other and provide then a multiple pressure effect on the seabed, all with varying different intensities and frequencies. So the assessment of the status of the seabed needs to take account of a great variety of different pressures on the system. And the pressures come from all the different human activities that we do in the sea and of course on the land. And so there's a possibility for individual activities to yield multiple different pressures. So it's quite common for physical structuring of the coastline and in the offshore zone to lead to both physical loss and to physical disturbance and to have hydrological effects. So that's a sort of one-to-many relationship between the human activities and the types of pressure that they yield. So a little bit really about the importance of monitoring and assessing the seafloor. I think the first thing to reflect is that the Mediterranean seafloor is a hugely diverse area, well beyond the Posidonia beds and the coralligenous platforms that we often have a particular focus on, to have many different habitat types and a very wide range of biodiversity because of the sheer range of physical characteristics and depth of the Mediterranean Sea. The second point is that this seabed habitat is an essential habitat for breeding, for resting, for nursery grounds and feeding grounds for a huge range of highly mobile species. So different species of birds and mammals and reptiles and fish are all really dependent on the seafloor for their continued existence and health. And then the third point then is that as well as the biodiversity that is important in the seafloor, it provides a range of ecosystem services. I just picked out a few here. So we can think about the natural coastal protection and flood prevention that we get from having our natural habitats right on the coast, our our seagrass beds provide a good level of natural protection to prevent coastal erosion. Of course, we have the fish and shellfish and indeed algae that we get as food from the sea. There's a great amount of nutrient and contaminant processing and recycling that comes from the sea. We have enormous recreational benefits, both as observers from the shore, from the scuba diving, from snorkeling. And then the last one that's often a little bit hidden in the process, but is coming more and more to prominence in the discussions about climate change, is the carbon sequestration processes, which are new studies are now showing that the carbon sequestration, the carbon capture into the seabed is at least of as important as that happens on the land into the forests, and the bottom fishing is causing a great disruption to this carbon cycle and regenerating the carbon back into the water and then even back into the atmosphere. So it's a very significant issue to try to handle. So overall, the seafloor is a very key component of the Mediterranean ecosystem, and it provides multiple functions and benefits for the wider marine ecosystem and for humans as well. I illustrate now a couple of the ways in which the seafloor integrity is assessed in other parts of Europe. And this is done within the context, this particular example is done within the HELCOM Convention for the Baltic Sea, and is done also in the context of the Marine Strategy Framework Directive. And here there is a compilation of the activity and pressure data that occur from multiple activities, as you can see, trawling, mariculture, extraction of sediments, wind farms, pipelines, and cable protection and shipping. And so the data are brought together and modeled into a single indicator to express the extent of possible impact on the seafloor. So these are now quite well established methods for assessing the physical disturbance to the seafloor. And then the second example is the reuse of assessments from other parts of the assessment, the QSR assessment process. And you'll see this in the proposal we talk about in the next presentation, where we have here under the OSPAR Convention, they have reused the assessments from the Water Framework Directive in the coastal zone, and in particular the assessments of the benthic vegetation, in order to derive an assessment of the state of the seabed within these areas based on the already existing assessments from the Water Framework Directive. So this is a good example of how to reuse data from other assessments to contribute to an assessment for Ecological Objective 6. And then the last slide is really to come back to this issue of the relationship to Ecological 1 on benthic habitats. And so I've very briefly compared the two in terms of the different characteristics. So EO1 has a focus on very specific habitats at UNIS levels 4 and 5, often subject to very significant threats, while the EO6 proposal is for a much broader perspective to look at the wide range of habitats at level 2. All these habitats are essentially subject to the same range of pressures, although these vary in intensity and in their distribution across the Mediterranean. For measures, you would expect more targeted measures on EO1 and broader measures to apply for Ecological Objective 6. The common indicators are already well established for EO1 in terms of habitat distribution and habitat condition, and these would be equally applicable to the EO6 situation. For EO6, the 28 subdivisions are proposed for the assessment of the Mediterranean, and it would be possible to use that framework again under the EO1 purpose. And then in terms of the monitoring, the focus for EO1 is on specific monitoring methods and on the biological data on the seabed, whilst for EO6 there's a broader focus on collecting the distribution of pressure and activity data. And that is it. I'll leave it with this a message that I presented before, just to say that the seafloor of the Mediterranean is a really important part of the Mediterranean ecosystem, and its good health is good business for the biodiversity and good business for us as humans. Thank you very much.